The Aquest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to this episode of the Aquest Podcast with me, Danny Lawler. If you're new to the podcast, do hit like and subscribe, and feel free to share and send it out into the world as well. For this episode, I'm joined by Syl O'Byrne. Syl is a financial services lawyer by training and worked for many years both in practice and in industry before making the leap into the independent directorship space. So we chat about his early career, and we also chat about some of the things crossing his desk as an INED. Now, the great thing about doing these conversations is that you never quite know where the conversation is going to go. And of my big list of things I had to chat with Syl about, I think we got to about item 3 before time ran out and we had to wrap up. So we do spend quite a bit of time talking about the regulatory burden generally, the standards that are required, the kind of level and depth of the compliance rulebooks as they stand, and the negative impacts that can have in terms of competition and barriers to entry and what that means for consumers. We cover that, and we also cover quite a bit about the individual accountability framework and the impact that that is having or is likely to have across regulated firms, and I guess from his perspective as an independent director. And we do manage to chat a little bit about the specifics of the items that are on his list to do at the moment. So with that, let's get on with the podcast.
The Aquest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hi, Syl. Welcome to the Aquest Podcast. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Danny. Great to talk to you.
So we're going to chat kind of about what's on the independent director's radar as a funds director and involved in the funds industry. But before we did that, I was just interested to learn a bit about your journey from professional to INED and how you've transitioned from one to the other.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, I'm a lawyer by background and around 30 years since qualified. And
you don't look at it.
I've thank you. But I've a mixture of, I suppose, in-house and practice experience. Dual qualified, worked in the States for a number of years, and then worked in asset management and funds pretty much since 2000 in-house and practice roles. And I suppose I started off in-house really and in working for a service provider. So it was kind of a narrow range of from a regulatory point of view and from a legal point of view, the range was narrow. And then I moved into practice because I wanted a broader experience. And have worked in large firms, global asset servicing firms and management companies. When I was in a management company, I was on a number of fund boards and enjoyed the experience. And then subsequently, that was an opportunity to move in that direction after working as a lawyer for a long period of time. So,
and do you miss practice?
I don't miss practice. No, I enjoyed my time in practice. But I think I was fortunate in the timing when I started because the industry was very dynamic and there were a lot of opportunities. And that kind of propelled my move from practice to in-house and back and forth in different firms, from fund administrators, depositories to management companies. And I was always interested in learning more and trying to get closer to the business and servicing the assets. I think in practice, certainly in financial services practice, it's very enjoyable, it's very challenging, it's very, very demanding, but you're really removed from the business. So when you work in-house, you get an opportunity to get much closer to the business and a better understanding or different perspective on it that you don't get in practice.
And the landscape here, particularly if you look across the legal practices and the number of legal practices that are here now with financial services offerings compared to when we worked together in private practice, and it was a much smaller number of firms offering that skill set. It's quite different, isn't it? It's quite a crowded, busy, competitive marketplace.
You mean in the INED space? Or
in the legal practice space?
It is. And I suppose, coming back to what I said about being a very dynamic sector, from basically since the whole UCITS regime was brought in, it's constantly changing and evolving. But the part of that is on the law firm side, you're right, was the opening of the specialist legal market in financial services to foreign firms. So, and again, that was part of my experience. An opportunity arose when one of the Caribbean firms, the first Caribbean firm to moved moved to our Open in Ireland, and I was one of their first hires, and that was a whole new experience, and it was a structural change in the law firm environment here, and it's led to a lot more diversity. So we had the offshore firms from the Caribbean coming in, but then we had more onshore firms from the UK, the likes of Simmons and Pinsent Masons, and now the US firms, Deckerts, and some of the other US firms here as well. So again, it shows really the growth in the jurisdiction. It shows the growth in products, the complexity of the whole sector, and the opportunity there.
Yeah, the opportunity, and I guess the competitiveness. And then if we do think about the INED space too, and the community that's there over that, in parallel over that period of time, you have a lot more in terms of training available for people who want to get into that space. So I guess they've got their own professional experience. They've got access to very good quality training and qualifications. So you really have quite a deep pool of people who are very professional in how they approach their independent directorships. And I guess on your side, then it's competitive. There's a lot of people in that pool, but it does mean that the standards generally then are always on the increase.
Absolutely. I think there's a number of factors coalescing together. There's the increasing volume of regulatory change and the complexity of it. There's the increase in firms that are here and the services they're providing. And then there's the increased training, so on top of, say, for an INED, on top of your core professional experience and your work for 20 plus years in a particular area, then you need to add to that with other skills, like other qualifications as well.
Yeah.
Like CAFD or
and bring all of that experience and training qualifications to an INED role. And you mentioned about the regulatory agenda. So it's pretty big and pretty broad, and we'll have a chat about that in the moment. But as you kind of are involved with boards, are there, what is it that's on your radar at the moment? What are the big ticket items that make their way as standing agenda items that are keeping your attention?
Well, I think there's, on the one hand, I think broadly speaking, governance is one of the key things, and everything flows from the governance. And then there's the specific subject matter areas, like whether it's reporting, whether it's Annex 4 or MiFID reporting, or ESG and SFDR, or the cyber data protection. It's the robustness, outsourcing, operation resilience. The list is certainly getting longer. It's not getting shorter.
Absolutely. And it does seem to me that every time there's a new central bank year CEO letter on a particular theme, whether it is cybersecurity or it is valuations, or shortly it'll be the common supervisory action on SFDR will be completed. So there'll be certainly a dear CEO letter at the back of that. All of these items then seem to have a piece in that dear CEO letter that says, make sure this is on the attention of the board, or even a standing agenda item for the board, like something like cybersecurity is meant to be. That makes a lot of standing agenda items on the board. So how do you kind of cope with there being, that intensity from a regulatory side, that all of this goes before the board, but then this just ever increasing list of items to be managed and kept under review?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It is a big challenge. I think we haven't really had the acceleration in the regulatory change and the volume, as I said, and complexity of regulatory change since 2008 has not let up. And, when you look at the regulatory agendas on the horizon, it's not going to lessen anytime soon. So it is a big challenge. I suppose it's, again, coming back to the governance. It's having the right framework, the right approach, and having a robust compliance calendar that captures all of these items and keeps them to the forefront of the collective board and maintain them on the agenda. But I don't think there's any short circuit for it.
And is it realistic to kind of continue to pile on tasks and responsibilities onto a board that, for the most part, if it's a fund board, it's an investment product, it's not an operating company, it's not an executive board, people who are committed to it for a certain amount of days a year, but to continue to add to that agenda and those expectations as well, is that, like, where does the breaking point come on that?
Well, I think there needs to be some balance, and I it's a very good question you ask there, and I think there needs to be, I think at a regulatory level there needs to be a pause and a more considered kind of approach. Like, you need to distinguish between the regulated firms and regulated funds. The funds are the products, and And you need to distinguish between the executive management and the independent directors. So as an independent director, I'm not involved in the day-to-day running of a regulated firm. I sit on fund boards as an INED. I sit on regulated firms, management companies, and other IAA firms. And again, I'm not part of the executive management team. So I think there needs to be a more considered approach at a regulatory level as regards, well, we're all only individuals, humans who have a particular qualification, skill set, and experience, and we bring that collectively to either the executive management team and the board if we're an executive director or as an INED. And no one person alone can cover all of these topics. And even if you look at some of the new issuances, like a lot of them are the volume alone of on the IAF side, you have multiple statutory instruments, you have guidance, you have standards, there's hundreds of pages, for example, just with the IAF alone. So it is a big challenge, and I think there needs to be some kind of more considered approach that I think in some ways IAF is helpful in that it maps out the job spec effectively of the executive management, and that is, as an INED, that is helpful because clearly it's a distinguishing factor because you don't have the day-to-day role. But at a principal kind of higher level, I think the rules are extremely prescriptive, voluminous, and labyrinthine, and they're increasingly so. And I think in some ways that is necessary in some cases, but there needs to be a qualitative and a quantitative approach. And the approach really, I think, it has to date in latter years has been more on the quantitative. So it's from a risk-based approach, it's from a quantitative numbers checklist analysis rather than a more considered principled approach. And I think we need both. You know, so just slavishly following checklists and bureaucratic processes, I think it's a more sophisticated approach is required.
And what have you seen the impact of, the individual accountability framework? We're recording, it's springtime. It only came into effect at the end of last year, the end of 2023. The senior executive accountability regime, part of that commences in the summertime for the first wave of firms, and then it'll be a little bit down the tracks for everybody else. But it's here, it's been flagged for quite a long while in the run into it. Are you seeing any practical impact in how boards operate or how executives operate? Has it kind of played into what happens on a day-to-day basis?
I think it's still being embedded. Obviously there's requirements in from the end of the 2023, but I think the focus has been really, initially anyway, at a practical level, it's been on getting the registers in place, amending your policies, getting your confirmations, updating your contracts of employment, and getting all the administrative, bureaucratic kind of documentation in place, evidence compliance with those requirements. And then there's obviously the mapping of the roles and the change in the jobs specs and the certifications required as well. So there's a lot of administrative work to be done there. But again, as an independent director on regulated firm boards, you're removed from that. That's part of the executive management. So I suppose you're working on developing the delegating responsibility, overseeing the execution of the parties who have been delegated with the responsibility, getting proper reporting back and monitoring, seeking confirmations and ensuring that there's the proper culture around the training. And
I just wonder then, is it possible to square the circle of collective responsibility of the directors around the table as the board compared to the fundamental of the individual accountability framework, which is individual responsibility and there being an assignment of tasks to the individual so that they know it's their obligation and then you can hold them to account. So I don't know if it's possible to have both.
Again, it's a very difficult question. I think, well, we have both, as a matter of law and regulation, we labour under both. And I think, the old phrase, hard cases make for bad law. Ultimately, there may be a set of circumstances that will arise where some individual or the regulator will be caught in the process of a conflict between the collective and the individual responsibility. Clearly, at a basic principle level, individuals in senior roles and even in junior roles need to act responsibly and be responsible for their actions. And there needs to be transparency around what they're responsible for. And if they err, there needs to be consequences. At the same time, we've had, 200 years of company law, and there's an established principle of collective responsibility, and the board is collectively responsible, and the board is a collective of individuals with different backgrounds, qualifications and experience and skill sets. No one individual has all the experience or knowledge to come up with all the answers, and they're all bringing good and bad skills and habits to the party. And generally speaking, I would say from my experience, there's a consensual approach to decision making, and it's generally on advice particularly for a fund product or a regulated firm, where there's a lot of complexity, and there'll be like either an expert, in the case of cyber or IT, there'll be an expert opinion given to the board either internally or externally, or some legal or regulatory advice from an expert internally or externally, and the board will reasonably rely on that. I think that will continue, again, because of the complexity involved. And then you have to, so I think, and if we're talking about IAF, and the application of IAF for executive roles in regulated firms, I think it will be helpful to forensically, I suppose, allocate responsibility and accountability. And if there are failings, well, then they should become evident. Yeah. But I think at a board level, I think it's I think the regime doesn't make any distinction between executive and non-executive, albeit, it does say to the extent that it's limited extent of the individual's role, and clearly a non-executive's role is just that. Yeah. They're not involved in the day-to-day. Yeah. However, I think we'll just have to see.
I think if it ever came to an enforcement situation where you were trying to draw that distinction or create an individual accountability for somebody in a framework that is traditionally collective, I think that would be a hard one to successfully get through an enforcement process. I suspect, because you would be breaking new ground. But I don't wonder whether the real impact and the real positive, output of the IAF and SEER will actually be at that executive level, where somebody is individually responsible for a particular item, that knowing that it's on their head and in their remit, that they push through on that being resolved in a way that they're happy with, that they can sleep at night. And if that meets resistance at executive level or at board level or at group level, I think that it could be very difficult for the executive in that position if they want a change so that they feel they're carrying out that task properly, but there's resistance to make that change and whatever cost that comes with that. And that tension, I think, and how those tensions are resolved, I think, is going to be the real key to the impact of SEER.
Yeah.
So, but I think you're right. I think trying to pin individual accountability on somebody in a framework where they're traditionally collectively responsible is going to be a big ask.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that point that you've just made there is probably the key. If the individuals in the executive functions are responsible for whatever they're responsible for, they effectively have to be advocates for change when it's necessary and for resources. So that will inevitably lead to some tension, where there's never enough time, there's never enough resources in life in general, and probably in regulated firms. So I think that will force cultural change, and almost from the bottom up in a way, that we haven't. It's likely to embolden people in roles where necessary to either alert the regulator certain concerns they may have where things aren't being done to the degree necessary, or to force change within, and that will be a new development.
Yeah. And then in terms of the regulatory cycle, or the regulatory agenda, but where we're at in a regulatory cycle, so it seems to me that this plays out in that cycle over time, and it begins with a failing or a crisis or something going wrong, and then you have a reaction to that from regulators and legislators, and that continues for a period of time, probably until the cost of that reaction becomes disproportionate to the harm that you're trying to prevent against, and then those regulations start to be drawn back in a little bit, or you try to create a rebalance until you get to the point that you get your next crisis, and then you start all over again. Now, obviously, nobody wishes a crisis, and all of the work that is done is to anticipate what the next one might be and make sure it doesn't happen. And it goes back to your data quality and your reporting is a big part of that. But in terms of where we're at in the cycle, generally, regulatory change is never going to stop, because you're always going to have some form, you're always going to have innovations. You're always going to have people trying to do things differently, which is right. But as they do that, they introduce new risks. So you're always going to have regulatory change. But I just wonder where we're at in that cycle in terms of, you mentioned about, say, the IAF and the depth in that, and the amount of quantity in it, and the amount of quantity then that comes to your compliance framework and the pressure that it puts on it. It does seem to me we're getting into that space. Like, the compliance burden is very heavy. The rule books are very detailed. That creates its own risk about failure, because you're so focused on the minutiae that actually maybe you forget to see the bigger picture and forget to remember that it really is risks that we're trying to manage here. And I just wonder what your sense is. Regulators are never going to be that receptive to a whinge from industry that the regulatory burden is too heavy. But there does come a point where the cost, and ultimately this cost, is borne by customers, by investors.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, you touch on a lot of different issues there. That's very interesting. I think it comes back to what I said. You need quantitative and qualitative. You need the detailed, and you need the micro, and then you need the macro approach. So so we have a lot of micro at the moment requirements, micro, and we need macro perspectives as well at the same time, so that there's the correct focus. Obviously, what's happening in the economy and the wider financial services sector, it's in a constant state of flux, and you need the right focus at the right particular time in the economic cycle to manage the system. And that's not an easy ask that the regulators have to do, but that requires this micro and macro approach, I think. So and there's such a volume of material at the moment that I think we may, like, it's a long time since 2008 now, and a lot of the requirements have flowed from the crisis from 2008 to 2011, and we're still living through the effects of that from a regulatory point of view, 16 years later. But I think that if you look at certainly the Irish economy, and funds were probably part of the international economy, not the local. So a lot of the problems in the financial services sector were not in the fund sector. They were in domestic sector. And, when you look at the burden and the cost of regulation, it's a barrier to entry, it's a barrier to competition. It leads to, duopolies, like with the banks at the moment, with the pillar banks we have left. There's a lack of competition in the banking area. There's a concentration with management companies, with business. So there's a build-up of anti-competitive forces, I would say, and systemic risk in certain sectors. And, I think the volume of regulation and the burden and the cost of it do not help.
No, it makes a very high barrier to entry. And so I do think we're at a point where we need to look at the cost of that, and the cost of what that does to competition, and what that does then to consumer choice and consumer price when you put a barrier so high.
And again, I think the approach is, if you look at the IAF, it's a cross-sectoral regime, so it covers everything. I think the regulatory initiatives have been, there's a tendency to broaden and flatten everything, and to have one size fits all, subject to nature, scale, and complexity. I think that has flattened things out. So I think, if you look at the housing crisis in Ireland, there's a very little discussion about one of the things I observe is a lot of the investment is it's foreign capital building property in Ireland, whether it's investment property or whether it's housing. And, the banks haven't been encouraged to lend to domestic, small or medium-sized developers. And that is a direct result of lack of competition, lack of encouragement to fund a social need that is required in the economy. And that has fueled inflation, everywhere.
Yeah. And what I would say is I wouldn't expect the regulator to volunteer to reduce that barrier to entry. I think it will be up to industry to engage actively and probably cleverly, for want of a better word, to help everyone understand the costs. And I don't mean just in terms of financial costs, but the costs.
The wider costs.
Exactly, of where the having a very high regulatory compliance burden leaves us. And whether that, and maybe it is the right thing, but maybe it's not the right thing, or maybe it needs to be refined so that we are a bit more open to allowing firms in, so that there is more competition, and that we don't just make it, by making it so difficult to do business, we cut our nose off,
Absolutely. And I think, I don't, the regulator has done a great job, collectively since 2008, stabilizing and with all the authorities too. We're in a much sounder financial position than we were after the crisis, and that's in no small measure to the work by all the governmental agencies. But again, it's about balance and it's perspective at the right time in the economic cycle.
So that takes me on to item 3 on my list, but we're actually pretty much out of time. So just very quickly, when we think about the specifics on the agenda for the directors, so even if we think about this current season of the Aquest Podcast, we're looking at SFDR, we're going to look a little bit at DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, and some of the cybersecurity issues. We also look at EMEA refit. So I guess they're the topical things that I'm seeing, because that's what's made its way onto the agenda for the season. What are you seeing? Are they kind of top of your list as a director just at the moment?
Yeah, they are, and we've just gone through, I suppose, or we're in the process of going through, engagements on valuation and on ESG with the central bank. So that's very topical as well at the moment, and a lot of firms are engage with the bank on that, and delegation as well. So, I think that will in turn will bring further initiatives and maybe inspections in those areas. I suppose the ones you mentioned are DORA is a big item on everybody's agenda, and there's a way to go yet on that as regards implementation. So I suppose there's the items on the horizon from a pre-implementation point of view, from a planning perspective, and then there's the post-implementation review by the bank on the areas I mentioned. So they're keeping everybody busy.
Hence the need for a deep pool of INEDs and lots of legal firms with the skills to serve that need. Yeah. Great to chat to you, Syl. Thanks very much for your time on the Aquest Podcast.
Thanks so much, Danny. Great to talk to you.
The Aquest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversation.